that's good. Can we just take these lights down, just this first row down a little bit, tiny bit? Perhaps not all of them. Let's not be plunged completely into darkness. Can we have the lights at the back still on? No, all or nothing. Okay, we'll have a bit of light. It's a real pleasure to be talking here, and I'm really touched to see so many friends and colleagues having made the effort to turn up. It's great. I'm going to be talking a bit about my own work, and I'm also going to be talking a little bit about some of the things that excite and inspire me, in the hope of getting into a bit of a discussion towards the end about how we as creative people, as people who make things out of stuff, can allow both our passions and our intelligence to coexist and emerge within one piece of work. I should say straight away that I'm not one of these terribly fashionable, super cool, super ironic, you have to be very, very educated to get my jokes kind of artists. I'm incredibly passionately engaged in what I do. I'm one of those artists who thinks that you should take risks, you should take them now, and hey, while you're doing it, why not make it a big risk? So if there's anybody here that isn't passionate about the practice that they're actually engaged in, I suggest you take advantage of the darkness to sneak out now, because you're going to have a very boring hour with me. I want to try and, as you can see, I don't script my talks, so we'll have to see how it goes. But I want to try and aim for a position where I'm going to introduce you a little bit to some of the things that I've made recently. And I want to talk a little bit about my epistemological interests, my particular ways of relating to cognitive systems that have been very useful for me in relation to my aesthetic practices. And I want to talk about epistemology particularly from a phenomenological perspective, in the sense that the way in which the sensate data that we imagine or fantasize that we're receiving affects what it is that we think we might be perceiving. Along the route, I'm going to talk a little bit about computers. Don't worry, there's nothing scary going on there. I suppose I should come clean reasonably early. I am a little bit of a geek. I have actually realised this recently. I am one of those people who unfortunately sits on the tube reading Mac User. But I like to think that I'm a reasonably fashionable geek. I have an anorak, but I like to think my anorak has little fake fur cuffs at least, perhaps. But there will be a bit of computing stuff, but it's always a problem in computing when you're excited about what you're engaged in. So if at any point I start sort of going off on some tangent about fuzzy logistical systems or something like that, please jump in and ask me to clarify what I'm talking about. I don't want to get too deep into computing. It's not a computing lecture. I just want to raise a couple of points that I think might be very interesting, particularly for the people that are studying architecture here. I think we're existing at a very interesting moment. It's a very interesting time socially, where you get all these artists, all these contemporary artists, all these people who are into passion, into emotional investigation, into semiotics and linguistic ways of relating to the world, suddenly getting incredibly interested in all this stuff like virtual reality and cyberspace, which seems like the exact opposite of those kind of concerns. Those of us who've been at all engaged in this kind of stuff, I think would come to a kind of consensus that it's the points at which our attempts to plot those systems actually fail, which is where they're actually at their most interesting. I personally am not making work in virtual reality nor on the internet. I think making work on the internet's about as interesting as making work on the phone, pretty boring basically. But I think there's something very interesting about the attempt to make work in virtual reality. It tells us something incredibly interesting about our attempts to plot the coordinates of reality. Again, working with intelligent agents tells us something very interesting about what we think intelligence might be. So it shows us something very interesting about our logistical processes. And I think there is one area which is potentially interesting for artists, which is emerging at the moment, and that's in building interactive systems. Artists and architects actually starting to work as programmers now and working with brittle non-brittle interactive systems. I think that it's something that all artists should take on board, what it means to be making work that is potentially intelligent, potentially has a relationship outside of your intention. And obviously those of you who are studying architecture will know that this is already a massive issue of debate. If you're designing a building and you're going to put some kind of intelligent systems into that, if you're designing an intelligent building, you not only have the huge issue in terms of intention which artists face, but you also have a massive ethical question in relation to your responsibility as the person that's originating that system. However, we'll start with something altogether a little bit more conventional. Does this turn the slide projector on, Joel?
You just need the blue button on the...
Blue button, okay. Altogether much more conventional. Does anybody know whose house this is? Come on, architecture. Call yourself architects. It's the house of the... there must be someone that knows. It's the house of the Duke and... Yes, Devonshire. Brilliant. Who said that? Give that man a gold star. It's the house of the Duke and Duchess of Devonshire. It's Chatsworth House. And believe it or not, this is actually the first place that I actually did a job, a paid job. I don't normally contextualise my practice in this way, but I thought it might be interesting for the architects here to trace some of my obsessions through from my previous career, which I normally try and forget in certain kinds of ways. And I think as I start talking about my work, and particularly my political relationship to the commodification of the work, you'll start seeing where some of my obsessions with space and autonomy are actually coming from. I spent nearly 10 years working as a conservator. An extraordinary and bizarre chain of events led to that, which I won't go into. But I worked very, very happily as a conservator for a long time, and I worked on wall paintings and frescoes. I don't know if I was exceptionally naive at that age. I suspect perhaps I was a bit more naive than most, but I have to say that I never addressed the philosophical issue of what on earth I thought I was doing as a conservator at all. Conservation is a wonderful job, and I have to be careful because I know that there are some people that have relationships to conservation in this audience, so perhaps we can get into a debate later on. But conservation was a wonderful arena for me to work in. But the thing about being a conservator is you are kind of automatically elevated into this position where you become the honorary custodian of the history of art. And I just caught the tail end of Mark Cousins' talk, where he was saying some very interesting things about history, which I think I would certainly agree with. This issue of just imagining, just fantasizing that you are preserving past art for future generations, I think is a profoundly flawed position. At this time, I was 18, 19, I was just so incredibly excited to be touching all these famous walls. I didn't really care, and I wasn't really thinking about it. I felt very proud to be remaking the past in this way. I have to say now that I think this is a really, really dodgy arena. To go into conservation as if there was some kind of smooth surface of historical continuity, like some kind of lovely tarmac road that you could just drive onto and coast down, is terribly naive. Obviously, whenever you're interacting with an object, you're affecting it in the traditions and the assumptions of the political moment that you're existing in. But nevertheless, I spent a lot of time turning stuff on the left into stuff on the right. Conservation is turning stuff like this into stuff like this. And incidentally, getting paid what I now consider to be a small fortune for it. Conservation was a wonderful job. It taught me all kinds of things which are incredibly useful in my practice as an artist. Obviously, it hones your dexterity. You have to have fantastic hand-to-eye coordination to be able to do this kind of meticulous work. It hones your spatial awareness. I spent years up on the top of scaffolds like this. This is St. Peter's in Vauxhall, for anyone who's interested. We used to sit on the top of things like this and kind of play games with each other, where we'd say things like, that cherub over there, I think that 23 millimetres between the eye sockets of that cherub. And then my companion would say, don't be stupid, 26. And then you come down the thing, and that scaffold, and you go up the other scaffold and you measure it, and yes, you know, whoever is closest gets the fiver or whatever it is you bet on it. And you're quite wealthy, so you can bet a fiver and such on it. So it's great for that kind of spatial, honing your spatial dexterity. But I think the best thing that conservation actually taught me, the most useful thing as an artist, was it taught me to have an incredible bravery in relation to space. If you're working on very, very long-term projects, I remember doing a job in Ely where we were cleaning, uncovering one layer of paint, taking one layer of paint off another layer, and doing it with these little things like, you know, the things you put in your ears, this little swab, Q-tip, yeah, like this, with a little swab. And you'd clear about this much in a day, because you had to be so careful about what you're doing. You come down the scaffold and you look up, and I mean, perhaps after a week and a half, you start seeing this tiny little patch of clean space emerging. So for a visual person to be working on these kind of projects where the visual rewards are very limited was a fantastic training in either patience or stubbornness, depending on whether you see it as a virtue or a handicap. It was good for me because I was very impetuous at the time, and so it calmed me down in terms of my aesthetic expectations. So that was excellent. I found that I had a real talent for retouching. I've always been a sort of accomplished painter in quite a sort of naff sense. It's something that I've just always been able to do, paint things that look like things. So it's nothing that's credit to me. But obviously if you're working in conservation and you have this capacity to, in effect, efface yourself and make damage in damaged works invisible, you have a highly saleable commodity there. And so I did very well, and I had my own business, and I went all around Britain and around the world as well, retouching the damaged parts of paintings to the extremes of things. I was getting sent things that looked like that. A couple of things coincided towards the end of my time in conservation. I started questioning the extent to which I and the people that I was working with were being asked to actually intervene. This is a painting that some of you might know, which burnt down in Enfield in the late 80s, mid 80s. This is the photograph, this is the plan, and this is the material that we were working with. Now I kind of pictured myself at this point as this kind of heroic, person on this kind of charger who would turn this stuff, back into this stuff. And incidentally, if you see the central Ariadne figure there, this is actually her face. And it was when somebody actually brought this to me and said, it's her face, that I kind of started getting really quite despairing about this endeavour. I also was uncomfortable ethically. Don't know quite put it. Okay, let's not beat around the bush. Basically, if you can do this kind of stuff, you can do forgery. And I started becoming very uncomfortable about the sort of things that I was being asked to do, and I started realising that there was a whole politic going on, which I hadn't really taken any notice of in relation to making commodification of artwork and making things that were damaged look really not damaged at all. The other thing that coincided with this around the same time was that I became really quite seriously ill, and I realised with some brutality that it wasn't a dress rehearsal, that it was my life, and if there were things that I wanted to do, I had bloody well better get on and do them. At this time I was 28, and it's I think there are some people that are intrinsically aware of the fragility and the marvellousness of their life. Unfortunately, I wasn't one of those people, and it took a really enormous physical shock to actually shake me out of my rather complacent sensibilities. So I decided to stop being a conservator. I had always wanted to make my own art, but I'd never been brave enough. I'm not dissing conservation in general, but I think for me it was a way of being sort of engaged in a visual practice without actually taking any kind of personal risk. So it was a kind of cowardly way of me being involved in it. Plus, I was starting to get very suspect about the whole politics of what I was doing. I kind of, rich young woman, you know, nice house, nice car, nice job, nice marriage, threw it all away to start, including the marriage, sadly, to start making art. I started making, when I started making art, I have to say, perhaps to my shame, I hadn't really got it sorted. Basically, I knew painting, so I thought, I'm a painter. So I just started painting, and I painted what must be some of the most truly appalling paintings that have ever been painted. And I'm in the spirit of generosity, I am going to show you some early work, but I'm even too embarrassed to show you these paintings. I painted like conservator, highly polished, highly stylized, super photorealistic, incredibly naff. And I was really on the route to being, you know, some kind of appalling portrait painter when I was saved by an introduction to some people who were very into printmaking. They also suggested to me that it might be quite a good idea if I got a bit of schooling. That there was like a whole lot of stuff going on in the contemporary world, which, as I'd had my sort of, you know, head stuck up this scaffold for the last 10 years, I really didn't know very much about. So I went back to school and studied at CAS and then at Goldsmiths. And started making prints. Now don't worry, I'm not going to sort of show you every piece of work I've made. I'm just going to show you a couple of things for specific reasons. A couple of early prints, and I'm only showing these to raise two issues. Issues in relation to form, the issue of seduction and the issue of tendency. Two things that I kind of fight against and with continually. Seduction in the sense that I started getting, when I first started doing printmaking, I got so caught up in the aesthetic of it. I'm one of those people that has a fantastically strong visual relationship to the world. The visual seems to be kind of weighted far heavier than anything else for me. And I just found printmaking kind of too sexy, really. It's like that kind of pot noodle advert where they go, "Ooh, it's too gorgeous." You know, it was kind of like that. It was just all too gorgeous, and I've just got totally caught up in this totally sort of aesthetic surface relationship with it. The other thing that I wanted to mention, it's about this time I started working with photography as well, and to follow this seduction theme through. I was making a lot of work at this time that was quite erotic, quite highly eroticized, photographic images that I was then making a series of prints from. This is one of my favourites from this time, actually. This is called Life Size. It is life size. I mean, it's obviously not life size here. It's a large projection. And this is for the women in the audience. All the guys are going, "What the fuck?" And we're going, "Oh, yeah." It's for the women in the house. In terms of tendency and form, I found out something really interesting working in printmaking. I don't really know. I mean, maybe in the question somebody else can come up with a better word for this. I just use this word tendency because I don't know anything else. What I mean is that every form that you work in as an artist, especially if you're working cross-media, has a sort of movement that it seems to naturally be tending towards. So that if, for instance, you're really interested in the way that spatial occurrences affect our emotions, it would be pretty dumb to work in 2D photography. If what you're really fascinated about is the way that we perceive colour, HB pencil isn't really the thing. And I was making these prints, and I kept making more and more and more and more prints until I got, this is actually a sheet from a series in which there are 4,000. And when I got to 4,000 in a series of prints, I realised that I was probably working against the tendency of the form. And I realised that what I was actually doing was making films. I just a little bit stupidly was making them frame by frame. Printmaking was great for me because I was interested in the manipulation of minutiae. And obviously in a form like print making, you can very easily change tiny details. So it suited all kinds of neurotic, obsessive tendencies that I had at the time, which had been very well fulfilled by being this conservator with the little swab. And I think I still hadn't got completely sorted out. So it suited that very well, but it wasn't really built for the kind of stuff that I was interested in to do with narrative. So at this stage I started making films. Now I'm not going to actually show any of these films because there's not time. But I made a lot of pieces of work around this time. Basically films that were optically printed. I see a lot of the work that I made at this time as being early investigations into a phenomenological relationship with the world. I was basically interested in terms of cognitive constructs, I was interested in what are the conditions that allow something to be just enough to convince us on a human scale. And I was trying to look at this in terms of filmmaking. So I was doing a lot of it optical printing films within films, printing dual narratives, making installations that used strips of film laid out on light in this way. And basically this kind of led me to making slide dissolve works. When you're looking at a normal film in the cinema, you're looking at something which is running at about running at exactly 24 frames a second. And 24 frames a second, as we all know, is obviously just enough to convince the human eye that what you're looking at is movement. The films that I was making at around this time run at about 3 frames a second. They're shot at about 3 frames a second. They're shot as individual stills, and they're animated in the gallery space by a computer that's controlling the still images. So you're looking at something which essentially is a very sophisticated flick book, I suppose. That's the way I like to think of it. Actually, Joel, can you show the first video while I'm talking about this? I have to say, with no sound on anything. Not interested in sound. I have to say, is that the first one? Yeah. Great. If you just turn the sound down, perhaps. Yeah, okay. This is a video transfer from the first slide of work that I made. And I have to say, with apologies to Joel Newman, who's obviously is a video artist. I actually absolutely loathe the video aesthetic. I find it terribly impoverished. It's just not. There's just not enough stuff there for me. There's just not enough information. The thing that I loved about making these slide dissolve sequences. Project. I suppose I should explain first that I have a particular kind of relationship to my practice that means that what I'm really interested with each piece of work is allowing the piece of work to actually develop within the working process. What is it that I'm trying to get across to them? What do I need to develop in this particular piece of work to get across what I'm trying to get across? Now, that philosophical perspective means that I quite often have to learn entirely new skills or sets of skills when I'm actually making a piece of work. And in '92, I was trying to develop this piece of work, and I realized that the only way I could get the sensitivity that I needed in the computers was in the projectors was actually to use a computer. Now, I was 30 and I didn't know anything about computing, and I thought, oh, these kids seem to know everything about this and I don't know anything about it. But it is never too late to learn. I've ever since getting involved in computers, I've been on a kind of mini crusade to try and demystify computers for technophobes, and most artists being pretty technophobic. Computers are really easy. There's not a computer that's been built that is as intelligent as anyone in this room. I make a lot of work using computers now, and I actually support my practice through my computing skills. This is an installation shot of this particular piece. 3 projectors. I was involved in an enormous amount of material science research at this time to try and work out how these things could actually be built. Very difficult technically to build these things that look fantastically simple. I should also say, I suppose, while I'm showing this piece, that I'm incredibly ambitious on behalf of my work. I want it to work on lots of different levels. I'm really concerned that it should make an immediate visual offer, and a very generous visual offer. So you could just take this work on an aesthetic level. I'm also involved in a structural interrogation of the forms that I'm using. On a epistemological level, I've been trying to investigate the conditions of certain cognitive systems that we use, and particularly, as I said earlier, in relation to that on a phenomenological level. Now, this piece of work is actually called Not Named, and all of the works that I've made have been informed by my ongoing health challenges. Some of them directly and some of them indirectly. This piece of work was really about the difference between how you look and how you feel. It was to do with invisible disabilities. But having made this piece of work, I realised something that most artists realise quite early on, which is how the work reflexively looks back onto you. So you make the work, but it then remakes you, in the sense that you become the person that has constructed this thing. So I was making this piece of work that I thought was about language, about the viewer's relationship to the artwork. And I kind of became, oh yes, Marion, she makes work about disability. And I felt kind of rather uncomfy with this. Can you put the next video on, Joel? This is a piece of work which is actually shown in my, was restaged in my show in Kettle's Yard, which has just come down. A piece of work called Well. It's a still from it. It's another still from it. And this was a piece that was actually commissioned by the South Bank Centre and hung in the Royal Festival Hall. This is just in a spirit of generosity for the architect, so you can see my naff little construction. It's quite a simple optical trick. It's basically a massive periscope that the viewer can move within. You have 3 projectors on a ground floor here, shining the beam into a mirror which is held at 45 degrees. The light is bounced up onto this level, where there's a screen which is reflective and transmissive, so it holds an image on both sides. In this particular staging, this is a light baffle, which is just reducing the light below. In the Kettle's Yard staging, there's another mirror operating as a second periscope up there. So the effect in this particular staging was you came in on this level, and you saw what appeared to be a shimmering pool of water suspended in the middle of a staircase. And as you came up to it, you could then come down and investigate the way that it was actually made. So it was kind of like, here's the magic trick that you wanted, narrative, basically, and here's how it's constructed, actually out of stills. So all these pieces of work kind of look filmic, but when you actually come to see how they're made, you can see that they're just really ordinary slide projectors clunking in a very sort of tacky way through their processes. There's always a story in these narratives if you want to relate to them in that way. I mean, in this particular piece, the piece is called Well. It was hung in a stairwell, and it refers to being unwell. An image of a shot underwater, simply trying to get out of a large pool of water. Vocal problems here. Trying to get out of a large pool of water. There is no route out of this well. So eventually they come up to the surface, at which point the surface actually explodes into flames. So it's really about 2 untenable environments represented by this very fragile screen, neither of which are really suitable. And Helen Sloan has actually written very intelligently about this in the catalogue for the Kettle's Yard show. She talks about cycles, and one cycle being continually marginally preferable to the next cycle. So it's this kind of thing of, well, what is it that's just a little tiny bit better than something really shitty? It's, still something pretty awful. It doesn't actually mean that it's great. Oh yeah, this is again for the architects, because I thought it might amuse you. I always make models and out of cardboard, obviously. These are my naff little models. I'd love one day to meet an architect who would make me some really sexy, lovely white models of everything. But it's been good enough so far. A couple of skewers there, it works. And again, my rather naff drawings for the South Bank. And this is an image that I just keep on my studio wall, actually. to stop myself when I feel myself getting a little bit crazy with my tendencies, because this is actually from when I was filming this piece. I actually built this tank in the house where I lived with my then incredibly tolerant partner, who for some reason is no longer my partner. And we actually lived with this stinking tank of water for 6 months while I was working out how to film this piece. And that's me trying to sort out the rostrum camera above this tank that took 2 tons of water. The reason I keep this photo is, I don't know if you can see, but this is me actually holding a mask, a wax mask of my face in order to position where the centre of the tank is. Why I felt it necessary to make a wax mask when I could have, just sort of held this, something like this, I can no longer say, but it's a good thing for me to keep by me when I get into those conditions where I'm thinking, no, it has to be like this, no, it has to be like this. It kind of reminds me that, to chill out a little bit sometimes. This is a very bad installation shot of it in the South Bank. These were before the days when I'd met Edward Woodman, so I didn't actually have a professional to help me with my installation shots. This is a slightly better shot of the piece hanging in Goldsmiths. From above, again, fire. And this is a good view of the mirror acting both as a reflector and also, obviously, while it's acting as a reflector, it can't help acting as a mirror, so it's mirroring what it's reflecting. So you get this periscopic virtual view of it set back into space there. The sequence at the end where the fire explodes, I actually filmed this also from hanging out of my bedroom window with a zoom lens, and my then very tolerant partner, of course, got the bum end of the job. He was down below lighting the paraffin. I considered actually doing it, and then I thought, no, it's just a little bit too dangerous even for me. So I actually used a mask in the end. And this was one of the rare instances where I'm thankful for living in Leytonstone, because Leytonstone is one of those wonderful community places where everyone's behind their net curtains. And while this was actually being filmed, I was completely unaware. I was just looking through the camera, kind of going, yes, that's great, that's great, that's great, that's great, unaware that one of my neighbours had actually called the fire brigade. So I was actually interrupted by a whole lot of burly men in boots traipsing through my living room to actually alert me to the fact that there was a fire in my garden, which obviously I was well aware of. Can you stick the next video on, please? Just one more piece of work, and then I'm going to show you some work from Kettle's Yard. This is Deserter, still from Deserter, which was made for Moviola, for the Liverpool Tate, for Video Positive in '95. I was very lucky that I won a scholarship which had some travelling money attached to it, and I had this idea for a piece of work that I wanted to make, which was needed to be filmed in a desert. And a lot of people said to me at the time, well, why does it need to be filmed in a desert? Because nothing really happens in the story. It's an everyday tale of disappointment. It's basically a woman walking in the desert, searching for water. She can't find it. Several days and nights pass. Eventually she finds it and throws it over herself in ecstasy, at which point it turns to sand in her hands. So she just gets up and carries on. All these films run on loops, so what appears to be a journey or a narrative actually turns into a process. So it's a never-ending cycle of perseverance. It could have been filmed anywhere, but I had this idea about it that I wanted it to be, in visual terms, be incredibly aesthetically seductive. So that initially you thought, wow, that's fantastic, I would love to be there. But then almost straight away you think, oh no, hang on a minute, that's actually untenable. I couldn't actually survive there. So it needed to be somewhere that was beautiful but not suitable for human habitation. Of course, when I got to the desert, I found it was beautiful and not suitable for human habitation. I can say with my hand on my heart that I've had operations that I would rather repeat than ever go back to the desert to make a film. It was an incredibly foolhardy thing to do, to go into a survival situation and be just really worrying about whether there's a grain of sand on your camera lens is not suitable. And the very good-natured person who I went with, who I persuaded this would be a terrific adventure to, is still so traumatised that he can't walk on sand. So we had a bad time there. Again, very difficult piece to make technically. This is one of the drawings that I produced for the sponsors. I had to raise a lot of money, sponsorship money, to make this piece. And the piece, it's a filmic piece. The film is basically, I don't know if you can see this top image here. You basically, the film is projected onto a very large 5-metre screen, at the corners of which are 4 sheets of surveillance mirror, the kind of thing you have in police stations. So from the inside they're mirrors, and from the outside they're transparent. And I'm sure we all know that very simple optical trick. I mean, everyone's probably done it at home in the bathroom in front of the mirror, where you hold 2 pieces of mirror up and you get endless. Nobody's looking at me. They've never done it. I'm the only person that's ever done this. You get endless reflections of your face. You know, I used to do it when I was a kid. So basically, it works on that very simple optical trick to create this fantastically linear structure. It was very related to the architecture. I don't know if people know the architecture up in the Liverpool Tate. These very dominant pillars, and I was very concerned with trying to map exactly these virtual territories onto these actual pillars, so that when you walked in, it appeared that the space was actually bisected by a string of projections that were standing each within each pillar. It was a kind of critique of mapping as territory, a kind of critique of linear and causal systems. That's where I was coming from formally on this piece. This is my model. Slightly better than the previous model. Why am I having such trouble with the microphone, Joe? Okay. Mark Kalmus didn't seem to be having a problem. So, apologise. I should just talk without a microphone. That's the model, anyway. I've got a little bit better model making techniques. And that's the actual piece. So you can see it's like really not much difference. I don't know why I bothered raising money and making it. These installation shots, fabulous installation shots, I have to say, taken by Edward Woodman. And for those of you who've never tried to photograph something like this, this is a fantastically difficult thing to photograph at all intelligently. Light projections in spaces are things that you can really only experience on an individual sensate level. On that level, I really like to think of my work as being performance art, in the sense that if you weren't there, you really missed it. That's quite important to me. Because of my kind of earlier engagements with forgery, I'm very anti the commodification of the art object. I'm not really very interested in the art object entering into a gallery system and getting commodified, getting sold and resold and resold. What I'm interested in is making performative works where you actually have to go and engage with the space personally. This is really coming from a kind of my philosophical perspective. I have to say I'm not, even though I did study at Goldsmiths, I'm not really a postmodernist at all. You'll be glad to hear. I think the big problem with postmodernism was its tendency to throw away everything that had happened previously, chuck away the last 3,000 years of philosophical thought. But the one thing that I am in line with postmodernism on is the issue of the viewer's relationship to the artwork. I believe that my artwork is happening in the mind of the viewer, and rather than it being located in the sensate object. That is, that something is happening to the viewer. It is amazing to know somebody who can actually get some kind of a semblance of how being installed in chapter. This shot is put in, this is just a still from the thing, put in for, no other reason than for your visual pleasure, really. The one thing about being in the desert, it is an incredibly humbling experience on a human level to know. There are live things in the desert, there are bats and such, but to know that you're the only person probably for several hundred miles is pretty humbling. And when you actually see stars shooting like that, it does make it almost worthwhile. Not quite worthwhile, but almost. Around this time, I started working for a firm called Capgemini as an internet consultant, and I got really. This was where I really got introduced into various kinds of programming systems, particularly systems that might be interactive and intelligent type systems. This is a piece of work that I was making around that time called Send Me the Message I'm Expecting. The piece of work was really an attempt to talk about intelligent systems and smart passion. Sean Cubitt, I don't know if any of you know him up in John Moores, has written very eloquently about this issue. I think I was saying earlier that as an artist I want to take big risks, and I think a big part of being an artist is kind of walking on this sort of knife edge, which is very important if you're making work that you're going to take reasonably large risks with. But it's always possible that you might actually fall off this knife edge. And you get hurt very badly. And I think that this piece of work actually really did come cropper. It was in a show in Liverpool Tate organised by Helen Silverlock, and I think it was the weakest piece of work in the show. So it was a place in which I didn't really get on. I don't think I made a very good piece of work there, but it's useful to make that bad work. You learn a lot from it. One thing that did start working in Brockwell Park, did start a whole kind of fishy chain of events. This is a still from a piece of work called The Fundamental Flaw at the Heart of Heterosexual Desire. It's a piece of work that I've made many times. I've done it with lots of different fish. It's performative work. It's a very everyday tale of a woman who falls in love with a squid. Nothing unusual about that. They meet through friends at a dinner party, as one does. They're both quite shy, so it takes them quite a long time sort of to get it together. Eventually they do, and they decide to make a commitment to each other, and they're probably married. It's not really clear whether they're married. They're certainly living together, and they're certainly engaged in a physical relationship with each other. And after several years, she wakes up one day and just kind of turns over to see him and realises for the first time that he's a squid. I don't know if any of you know the quote, Fundamental Flaw at the Heart of Heterosexual Desire. It's a quote from Judith Williamson. This is actually my take on what the fundamental flaw might be. The fundamental flaw, for those of us who are unfortunately heterosexual, is that we are sexually attracted to another species. It's actually a very serious piece of work. I've made it many times, and there's actually another version, which I'll show you in a minute, in which some of the issues perhaps come out a little bit more seriously. This is the poster for the show that I've just had at Kettle's Yard. The work at Kettle's Yard is significantly, I think, a significant shift from the kind of work that I was making before, and there are several reasons for that. The first reason being that I felt I was making all these huge installations, and I felt I was getting a bit categorised as a size queen, in the sense that I kept getting kind of offered these big spaces and these big budgets to make these big works. And I started thinking, when I first started making art, it had been very important to me to make this kind of very long-term commitment to make these pieces of work that did take 2 years to make and then a year to in order to try and recover money. But I started thinking that perhaps there was something in this way of working that was a little bit self-protective, but perhaps I needed to take slightly bigger risks, in the sense that if you make a piece of work like Deserter, and let's just say it's a really bad piece of work, there's a sense in which the work is quite well defended, in that it's large, it's spectacular, it's clearly technically complex and difficult to make. So you can always kind of stand back with the relationship of the view going, oh, it must have been very difficult for her to make that. What I wanted to make for Kettle's Yard was some really teeny pieces of work, where basically, if they were bad pieces of work, it would just be really clear that they were bad pieces of work. I wanted them to be a lot less defended. The other reason that there was a big shift in my work was that about a year and a half ago, I had a serious head injury. And I mean, anyone that knows anyone that's had a head injury or that's been unfortunate enough to have a head injury themselves knows that there's something very quantitatively different about having a head injury than having injuries to any other part of your body. If you break your arm, you have an arm that doesn't work quite right, but you're still you. If you have a head injury from which you get any kind of brain damage, you are quite likely not likely to be you anymore. In getting tremendous support in recovery from my injury. And also I've been lucky that the brain damage that I have is actually very localized in the sense that my intelligence and my personality are not impaired at all. I'm essentially exactly the same person. I have a few medical problems, probably the largest of which is that my brain is no longer able to interpret signals from my left eye. So I suppose the simplest way to describe that would be to say that I'm blind in my left eye. However, it's not actually that simple because I do still have a sensate relation with my left eye. It's just one that it's impossible for me to articulate. And it's highly, I mean, obviously, now all of you will know enough about optics to know that you need two eyes to have binocular vision. Animals with only one eye have monocular vision. And you need binocular vision to see space. So I can see now, I can move around the world, but I see a very flat world. Now obviously, for an installation artist, to not be able to see space is like a bit of a problem. But I think for me, one of the ways that I've kind of coped with this, it's been fascinating for me as somebody who's had a lifelong interest in phenomenology and in the way in which sensate changes affect the world that you think you're in. It's been an extraordinary experience to actually become, if you like, one of the kind of guinea pigs in one of the experiments that I used to read about in New Scientist. I'm actually in Cambridge at the moment on a fellowship there, and I'm taking part in some experiments about certain kinds of hypothalamus damage, which is what I have at the back of my head, which are really to do with the way in which people that have this kind of damage have a particular relationship to space. So I've had to think a lot, I've had to rethink a lot my relationship to space and what it means to move through space. And so a lot of these, I think in a lot of these works you can see this kind of coming out. Incidentally, this is the poster, this is the band poster. I don't know, I mean, can anybody, does this image tremendously offend anyone here? This poster's been banned in Cambridge because Cambridge City Council say that it is so, it has the capacity to incite so strongly that if this is put up in a public space, people will do vandalism, not to the poster, but to the area around it. So it's a property concern, basically. I think it's really kind of silly, actually. And I was quite upset, really, because it's a serious piece of work. It was not easy to do. It's not used from a sensationalist point of view at all. And I thought it was really trivializing the work that they banned it before they'd actually come to see the show. Of course, the gallery were delighted because as soon as they banned the poster, everybody, wanted to come and see it and buy it, and it went up in all the cake shops and such. It really did, actually. When you come into the show in Kettle's Yard, the first thing that you're confronted with, talking about making some very small pieces of work, this is a life-size image of a lollipop, a lolly stick. It's not a found object, which somebody asked me in a workshop the other day. Obviously not. It's a lolly stick that I've hand painted with a joke. The question on it is, what's the best thing that you can get out of this world? And if you bother to actually go around the exhibition, you'll find its sister piece where the ice cream has actually melted. So I made the lolly, I made the ice cream. The hardest thing was actually getting the ice cream the right consistency. And I made the strawberry coating. It's supposed to be a strawberry mivvy. And it's got that feeling of like, you know, you're out on a nice day, sunny day, picnic, ice cream, you've dropped your ice cream in the grass. What do? Do you like pick it up and eat it all gravelly, or do you just accept the fact that you've lost it? Another very small piece, this is actually about, this is an etching, this is actually about 2 centimetres high and about 6 centimetres across. And this is from a series called Superheroes. This is number 3, and it's Dr. Disabled, or Dr. Disabled, as I prefer to think of him. One of the guys that drilled holes in my skull suggested to me, brain surgeon, yeah, suggested to me that I should take up a physical activity which had a large spatially challenging component to try and learn more about my new relationship to space. And he actually suggested fencing, which sounded great, but where you do fencing in Leytonstone, I don't know. So I thought I'd take up rollerblading, and I can really heartily recommend this to the architects here. When you put wheels on your feet, you really do get a very, very different relationship to space. You're moving through space at a phenomenal rate. It's very thrilling, it's very scary because it's easy to go and it's terribly difficult to stop. Basically, you know, I mean, the only way to stop when you start is to actually fall over. And I just, you know, you get a helmet, you just accept the fact that to stop you fall over. So I spent a lot of time while I was kind of recovering from this brain injury, rollerblading, you know, this kind of partially sighted crazy woman, rollerblading around the streets of Leytonstone, you know, at least 20 years too old to be kind of getting into this kind of practice. All these kids whizzing by. In rollerblading jargon, a complete beginner, somebody who's just started, a novice blader, is called a pavement inspector, because obviously you inspect the pavement a lot. I'm a little bit better, but at this stage I was, you know, pavement inspector first class. So I spent a lot of time with my face on the pavement, looking at and getting very excited about navigating the streets in relation to these signs. And so these urban superheroes were all things that I came across at this time. This is a piece called Personal Best, which was made site-specifically for Kettle's Yard, and it won't be going up anywhere else. It was made for a ramp in Kettle's Yard, a disabled access ramp. It struck me incredibly strongly as being a really beautiful architectural feature when I went there. Those of you who haven't been to Kettle's Yard since it was redeveloped should really get there because it's an amazing space now, really, really interesting space. And there's this wonderful ramp, which is a great feature, but is also obviously the only way into the gallery if you're in a wheelchair, if you've got any kind of physical impairment. For those of you who are interested in these things, it was composited in live picture. It's made pixel for pixel. There's no interpolation here. It is an image that is 8.5 meters by 2 meters. This is it actually in the gallery, and this is the ball. The ball is on offer in the space, really on offer just as a visual offer. But I have to say I had this incredible experience in the gallery about 4 weeks ago when I walked into the gallery, and I walked in at this top part here, and there were 2 women who must have been in their late 60s or early 70s, and they were here on the ramp with the ball. Both of them. And I was so flabbergasted, I just sort of looked like, I didn't say anything, but I gave this look which said, "What the fuck do you think you're doing?" And one of them said to me, "Oh, we thought we'd give it a go." And I thought, well, that's amazing. I mean, they really were, you know, like kind of American tan tights with wrinkles, and, you know, it was fantastic. It's a very straightforward piece of work. It's a piece that's gone down incredibly well in Cambridge. I think it's clear. It's a very clear piece of work. The ball is exactly the right size to actually just make it up the ramp. And I think it's, you know, it's kind of clear. Personal best as opposed to a world record. The best that you can do personally, as opposed to any kind of competitive relationship with anyone else. One thing that I think is amazing in relation to the kind of work that I'm trying to do, a lot of my work is issue-based, and I think it's important for me as an artist to engage as bravely and as honestly as I can with the actualities of my life. But I also think it's very important not to use your experience as a kind of weapon. And let's face it, nobody's interested in work that's cathartic. Nobody is interested in work where the artist is just sicking up their personal experience onto the viewer. You know, if you need therapy, then go to therapy. You know, I don't want to make that kind of artwork at all. What I'm interested in is, I suppose, honestly taking actualities and making work that is founded in real things, but in which there is enough space so that the viewer can come and put their own experiences onto that work and make some kind of connection to that. So I'm always trying not to stitch up the work too much, not to make work which is about, you know, X, because I think that immediately alienates anybody who hasn't had, you know, whatever experience X is. One thing that I think is astonishing in relation to this piece is when I started making this piece and showing people drawings of it, somebody said to me, oh, I love your Sisyphus piece. And I was a bit embarrassed because I didn't know who Sisyphus was. So I kind of had to go and find out. And I'm sure you'll all know about this. It's a Greek myth about Sisyphus, the king of Corinth, was condemned to roll a steel ball up a hill every morning, and every evening when he woke up it had rolled back down. Now, I think that's amazing that somebody wrote this myth 2,500 years ago, and I just rewrote it in relation to this particular ramp that I saw in Kettle's Yard. I really, really enjoy that a lot.
Is the ball heavy?
Well, it's actually, no, it isn't actually heavy. It is quite light, and the person who's actually pushing it there is somebody who is profoundly disabled and has spent most of her life in a wheelchair. So it wasn't actually possible for her to interact with a heavy ball. So it's actually a very light ball. It's actually made out of fiberglass. But in the gallery, it was filled with gravel. So in the gallery, for the two women on the ramp, it was incredibly heavy. Yeah. It's also a horrible job for the assistant who had to put all the gravel in with a funnel. This is a piece called Wildfire. I don't know how clear it is to see what's going on here. A photographic piece. It's a whisper that's passed around the space. 5 actors pass the whisper, one from each. So this woman passes it on, and so. It's a series of 5 double-sided light boxes on which you see the front and the back of each moment of exchange of the whisper. And I was really lucky to be working on this piece with Edward Woodman, who had fantastically ingenious solutions as to this problem of how to actually photograph the actors front and back simultaneously. I was dogmatic that it had to be formally pure, so I didn't want, it wasn't just like something like the same moment, and then let's run round to the other side with the camera. The point was, how different does a scene look when it's photographed simultaneously on 2 sides? So Edward actually set up the system where we had a channel in which the actors were facing each other with a camera on each side, that both shutters were opened, the flash was set off, that being the exact moment of exposure for both camera, then both cameras were shut. What is amazing is how different the photos look. I mean, I expected them to look different, but even to me, I can hardly believe that it is the identical moment. And the idea was to move people in and out of this rather implicating circle of whispers, to make them think about inclusion and exclusion, to make them think about which side of the whisper they were actually on. Obviously, they're probably gossiping about you, and in that sense, this is a still from it. You know that sense when you kind of hear your name? My hearing's not that great, but you hear your name across a room, and straight away you're kind of like zoom, right up against it, trying to sort of hear what the people are saying, and you can't hear. You just know that something might be being said about you. So I wanted to have the sense of really kind of zooming in to this moment of exchange that you are nevertheless excluded from. And to do this, we've used a slightly wide-angle lens just to slightly pull the person that's nearer you forward and push the other person back. So in this gallery, you have this really thin object of light, inside of which there's this massive virtual space. It's also incredibly cruelly lit, and I did explain to the actors that we would be seeing every pore. We all have moustaches, but most of us women spend quite a lot of time and money trying to make sure that nobody can see them. But you can see every hair on the moustaches of the women in this piece. Just tucked behind this piece, Kettle's Yard is an amazing space, full of kind of nooks and crannies. So great opportunity to put up these very small pieces of work. And just tucked behind this is a tiny etching, which a lot of people miss, and that's fine. For the people who see it, it's just maybe something that these people might be whispering about. It's just a tiny trompe-l'oeil etching, and it says, a man in Boston has killed his wife after a domestic dispute. The man, who is unnamed for legal reasons, took a kitchen knife, slashed her open, tore out her heart and lungs, and hanged them out on the garden railings after she had remarked that he overcooked the pasta. The piece is called Remarked, and I've been interested in a long time about the dangers of language. Oh yeah, this is my another squid rendition, another fundamental floor piece. Much more classical rendition, triptych here, typical situation of the sort of, if you read this classically, it would be Madonna with two angels. I wasn't sure how well this piece of work would go down, because I thought it was perhaps quite a difficult piece of work, but it's had an amazing response in Kettle's Yard. And a lot of people saying to me that the treatment of the squid, it looks like it's perhaps could be an internal organ. I mean, obviously, it's, you know, I said I've done this with an octopus and I've done it with a squid. And I mean, the squid works better because, you know, let's not beat about the bush. You know, the shape of the squid's body is fantastically phallic. You have this enormous phallus kind of hanging down towards her genital region. I'm quite aware of that. But I also wanted it to look like it could be the inside of her body, to kind of push the reading of her relationship to internal space and perhaps different genders' relationships to internal space. This piece, there's a still from it here. In the catalogue, this piece is actually a picture of this in the catalogue, and I gave a talk quite recently at St Martin's, and afterwards one of the students came up to me. This is somebody who's 18 and just started on the BA, and she said she'd bought this catalogue when she came to Kettle's Yard, and she was showing it to her mum to sort of say, oh look, this is the kind of stuff that I like. And her mum kind of stopped on this page, and the way she reported it to me was that she was getting quite sort of anxious because she thought, oh, it's a little bit sexy, and you know, my mum's going to be kind of scandalised, and my mum's going to say something like, you know, what the hell are you, you know, wasting our money doing this kind of rubbish. And so she sort of said to her mum, oh, it's about a woman who falls in love with a squid, you know, kind of. And, you know, like, as if that would explain it. And her mum said, I think this is amazing, her mum said to her, yeah, I know exactly what she means, because before I fell in love with your father, I fell in love with a rat. And you know, you've got it all there, haven't you? You've got linguistic problems, you've got problems across gender. Just fantastic, just absolutely. I love it when people tell me these kind of stories. This is the diptych rehearsal, on one side of which she eats maggots, and on the other side of which they come out as flies. It's a piece really about the kind of dissolution of the body and the fragility of flesh. I wanted to treat this photograph so that her body is kind of disappearing into space and becoming not obsolete but fallible perhaps, and yet nevertheless maintain this orifice absolutely stuffed full of seething life. There's a really, I don't know if any of you know Douglas Adams' work. He's actually, apart from writing The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, a very serious scientist. And one of my favourite quotes from Douglas Adams is, assumptions are the things that we don't know we're making. And I kept thinking about that when I was watching people in the gallery in relation to this piece. Assumptions really being the most important thing that you bring to this work as to whether you find it horrific or positive or celebratory or disgusting. For me, it's both positive and negative. And for me, the question is really, who's eating who here? Are the maggots feeding on her flesh, or is she perhaps feeding on them? I think yes. The way that it's actually arranged, and it's just an installation shot. They're arranged kind of on a corner there against each other, so it's not completely clear which comes first in that series. There are two other Maggoty pieces there, quite simple pieces really. Very simple structurally, large Cibachromes. This piece is called Trust Me, and it's obviously roses and red maggots. There's not photographically treated, this is the real colour that they come in. I've got a really good relationship with the guys who run the fishing tackle shop now, so I'm able to get maggots in whatever colour I want. And you can see it's in the shape of a heart, of Naff Valentine heart. It's a simple piece. I mean, like always on the 14th of February, you always want to hear that kind of plop, 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 don't you, when the postman comes, and this sort of mass of cards should be arriving. And of course, there are never any. And then perhaps, once every 3 or 4 years you actually get one card on Valentine's Day, but it's never from the person that you want it to be from. So that's the sort of tenor of that piece. Its sister piece, which is called Nest, which was also from the same series, is altogether a much more serious piece of work. It's obviously a failed nest. I've done a lot of interesting workshops, and people always seem to hone in on this piece. I think it's probably the most difficult piece in the show. Somebody was saying to me last week that this was a very gendered piece of work, but I don't think it's necessarily so. I don't think you have to have had the experience of having had miscarriages or having lost children to actually identify with this piece of work. I think these could be any aspirations that didn't actually work out. It's just a nest that is not going to come to any fruition. Obviously the nest is made of metal, so it's a pretty uncomfortable nest as well. This is a still from the title piece called I Won't Promise You the Earth, which kind of hangs together, I think, as a good title for the whole show. This is actually, it's very strange to see it projected like this. This is actually a tiny, tiny animation, about the size of a tennis ball. It's an animation made from thousands of paintings, hand-painted images of clouds, which are run on a simple video editing program to run as an animation. And the animation itself is in a glass enclosure which is slightly tilted, so as you go into the space opens up, and you get the effect that you get with tilted glass of creating a virtual circle around you, in which each part of the circle you get another one of these spinning globes spinning. It's a intentionally very small, almost apologetic, quite a fragile piece of work. I wasn't sure how well this would work. It's the trouble with making installations, and all of you who are architects will know this incredibly well. It's always the trouble that you never see the thing until it's built. And I was really worried about this piece of work. I thought if it works, it's going to be fantastically fragile and jewel-like and wonderful. And if it doesn't work, it's going to be some kind of naff Star Trek animation effect. The interesting thing for me was that a lot of people thought this was the piece of the show for them. And those were all people who were quite knowledgeable about technology, and I thought that was quite interesting, that there was something to do with the way that the technology in this piece is actually used, kind of counter the technology, that perhaps was something they were picking up on. If you're interested in that, I'd refer you again to Helen Sloan, who's written incredibly eloquently about that particular piece. Could you start the... I just want to could you turn the video off so that I can just start the data projection again? Just the last two pieces of work. Incidentally, this is a shot of Well, restaged in Kettle's Yard, another shot taken by Edward. The mirror on the ground floor, the screen there, and the mirror above. But I'm actually showing it to draw your attention to this piece here, which is a data projection which is called Patient. The piece of work is an object-orientated program, and what you're watching is a data projection of the program's attempt to carry out a task that I've set it. The task being to perpetually scramble and unscramble this text, which is about patience. It says it's worth remembering that a cube packed with touching spheres still has space in which smaller spheres can freely travel. So we can reach our destinations by patiently looking for the channels that others don't see, whether it's their fixed opinions or methods of transport that are causing the traffic jams. It was a text that I had, text comes from a conversation that I had with an actor, the actor Tim Welton, after his extraordinary performance in a play that was on at the Young Vic recently called The People Downstairs, which dealt very graphically with very serious physical abuse. And we kind of had this sort of jokey conversation about the issues, kind of clouding it in this concept of actually moving through physical space. What the text is doing at the moment is it's searching through every letter of the alphabet and every grammatical notation that it needs to actually decode this. As it goes on, it appears to get faster and faster. The program is arranged so that it takes the exact amount of time that the gallery is open to decode. So if you come in at the first thing in the morning, you see the I, and if you come in 25 past 5, you just see it getting to traffic jams. Obviously, I don't expect anybody to stay in the gallery. The point is to make a point for the whole day. The point is to make a point about patience. The other thing that's happening is that, and you can see it reasonably clearly now, is that every time a new letter comes in, the colour has changed minutely. I was trying to investigate the point at which you could see this colour change. When it's right at the beginning, the colour change is very gradual, and people were completely convinced that there was no colour change. But what would happen is they'd come in and they'd see this moving colour field. They'd be bathed in this kind of blue light. Then they'd come and have a look at well, and then they'd turn back to go out of the space, and they'd suddenly think, hey, shit, that projection is yellow. Wasn't it blue when I came in? So it was kind of operating in that very slow way. As it gets nearer the end, the colour change is happening at the same rate, but because you're reading the body of the text rather than looking at the bit which is changing, which is what you see to start with, you become more and more and more aware of the colour change, so it starts to kind of throb as it goes through. I had to actually change the programming on this partway through because this little cult was developing. It's extraordinary. This could only happen in Cambridge, of people who were coming at 25 past 5 just to see it like do its thing, just to see it kind of get to its point, and that was creating a little bit of a problem, obviously, for the gallery. They wanted to they wanted to close everything, and just suddenly a whole load of people going, "Way, traffic jams." So what I did was I just changed the program so that it actually does it perpetually, so it's complete luck of the draw when you come into the gallery. But it was extraordinary for me to be in the gallery and hear people kind of shouting like, "Hey, it's going to do its thing! It's doing it!" I'll just like push it on a little bit. Okay, so this was the kind of bit they got excited about this part. Yeah, that's what they wanted to see. Amazing, isn't it? People would actually kind of queue up for that. There's one other final piece of work that's in the show. There was another data projection called Light in Exact Proportion. All of these data projections were running with the actual computers in the space. There was no video trickery. They were actually computers chunking through these procedures that I'd set them in the space. And I think that perhaps the best piece of work in the show was this piece called Light in Exact Proportion, which actually proved completely impossible for us to photograph. And I kind of really like that in a way, that it wasn't actually possible to record this piece. It was two thin strips of data projection that were unscrolling, continually scrambling and re-scrambling and unscrambling a very short text from Simone Weil. The text saying, even if our efforts of attention seem for years to be producing no results, one day a light which is in exact proportion to them will flood the soul. And that I've only ever made two pieces of work that were ever for anyone, but that piece of work was actually dedicated to Maria Cavall. I think it was the best piece, but I can't show you, so you just have to take my word for it, won't you? I really just probably just want to say one more thing and then let you all go home. Just to show you first, before I say that, the lolly stick. The question being, what's the best thing you can get out of this world? On the other side, if you bother to find this, it says yourself. Either an incitement to mass suicide or something fantastically positive about personal identity, depending on what you are actually bringing to the work. So that's probably all I want to say, except just perhaps just one more thing. Yes, it's time to stop. Talking earlier about this kind of walking on this this kind of knife edge when you're making work, and particularly in relation to kind of whether you're making, whether you're kind of being passionate or intelligent, or perhaps both, about your practices. And I think of walking on this knife edge as being, the problem being that if you kind of fall off into the passion side, you'd be making this work which is gorgeous and seductive and aesthetic and decorative and ultimately vacuous. And if you fall off too much onto the intelligent side, then you're making work which is sharp and clever and interesting and probably rather self-congratulatory and closed and ultimately pretty impoverished, ultimately without any real soul. And that the kind of trick for those of us who want to make visual work in any sense is to kind of keep on the middle route between these two sides. So I think that's just the image that I'd like to leave you with as a sort of somebody who's trying this kind of attempt. Okay, thank you very much for listening.
They might not be able to.
Why?
Fabulous.
Thank you. This is really was not very good, was it?
No, I think this
is that me?
No, I think it's a faulty one. I can't possibly believe
Thank
it.
God though, because I know it was terrible. Thank God though, because I gave this talk at St Martin's the other day, and I had such a bad throat that I don't think anyone could hear me. So.
Oh no, they do these things through there.
Are they?
In terms of talking, we've noticed this recently that the questions haven't been coming as much.
Oh, you don't have to have any questions. We could all go to the pub.
Yeah. Well, I'll take you for a meal. Everybody's going to come.
Oh, great. Okay.
Going to get an eat.
Should just eject my disc actually. Is that all right? Sweet. I need to eject. Joel, can I eject my disc? Have you got is my disc still trapped in there with the?
Just want it.
Is it? Yeah, my disc. With the program on it, yeah.
I'd like to say, I saw your piece Deserter at the Shared Goals.
Because there are people that waiting. Could you try and throw your voice? Because we don't think
It's not so much a question, it's just to substantiate what you said before about you need to be in the space to see the piece.
Yeah.
And seeing the video.
Go for it.
Seeing, is it working?
Yeah.
Oh. Seeing the video, it was, it didn't show the piece at
No.
all, and I'd almost prefer not to see it.
Which
But
one?
I'm glad that you showed the installation shots of the piece, because that brought back the feel that it had. But in terms of the movement, I thought it was a shame almost to see the video.
Did you? Yeah.
I love the piece at Goldsmiths.
You like it? Oh,
yeah.
thank you. Can you hear me on this? Or can you hear me? Is this mic? Well, that's really nice. Thank you. It's always a dilemma for me to know whether to show these to show things. I mean, obviously, I could just say, well, I don't talk about the work, and that's it. You know, you have to see it, and that's it. But obviously, you know, making work. I'm interested in showing the work because I'm interested in trying to sort of communicate things to people. And also, it is part of making work is disseminating it in some ways. I think Deserter was the sort of zenith of that kind of work in a way for me, because, as you know, the film, you know, the filmic aspect of it was actually 10 minutes long. So you had to spend at least 10 minutes before you even realised there was a cycle. So it really, and by the time you then watch it again and you work out where the beginning and end is, and then you adopt some kind of a relationship to it, it was actually a piece of work that demanded that you spent probably half an hour in a space, which is an awfully long time to ask some. I mean, it's a filmic length time. It's an awfully long time to ask people to stay in the space, and it was obviously a kind of mood thing that built on you during that time. I hate it. That's why I don't look. I hate to see it on video. But
Do you think that bringing up this thing about documentation, is it that important to show it, to show the moving image again? Because it has such a totally
it has such a different effect, doesn't it? Yeah.
says something different.
I don't know. I mean, that's a thing for me to get feedback on. I mean, I suppose if I get a lot of people saying this kind of thing, then I'll probably stop showing the videos. I mean, it may be purer just to show an installation shot of it. And it is essential to have some kind of a documentation, because obviously, you know, you're talking to funding bodies and you're trying to get funding to make other work, so you have to show something. But there's still photographs are more, show more, don't they?
Of the space at the time, yeah. But then they don't show the motion, obviously. It's difficult.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about was your history of making with the conservative sort of thing. And it's something that I've had some problems with myself. I started work as a welder, so I had sort of that sort of background of sort of making. I certainly enjoyed the manipulation of the material.
Yeah.
Then became a restorer to London, sort of stone.
Just saying some interesting things. You probably can't hear.
Well, probably not interesting. But having made that sort of leap from industry to restoring, which I thought, again, would be a more satisfying sort of thing, reaching that point where you described where you're dissatisfied with some aspects of, I mean, the things that I would work on would be at the sort of higher end of the sort of art market in sort of small sort of bronzes and sculpture. And some of the shows that you go to, whether it be in New York or wherever, you weren't at all welcome on the stand, because if you were known to be a restorer, then why are you looking at this particular thing?
Yeah.
The main thing that I wanted to ask you about was materials. One of the things I've tried to do is shake off this, what I've seen as a monkey on my back of being able to do certain things in a certain way, and try different materials and different this, that and the other. But I think it's only a matter of time before you find that sort of again with a new material. Or is it not the case with you?
I think that's a really, really interesting question. This is the fly in my ointment, actually. I suspect that it's to be incredibly dexterous and to have a training in dexterity is obviously great as an artist, because you can see things clearly. Well, you can if you haven't had a whack around the head, but you can see things clearly, and you can do the things that you want. But yeah, there might almost be a point where too much facility is is something you have to fight against. I mean, I've been thinking a lot about this recently because I gave a talk in Cambridge at Kettle's Yard last week, and I was saying, oh, printmaking, you know, too seductive. And then immediately afterwards, this C++ programmer came up to me and started asking me, you know, and we got into this like head-to-head about, you know, handlers and, you know, we started just like, you know, totally geeking out together. And, you know, I then went home and read how to program in C++ until 5 in the morning. And I thought, well, you know, who am I kidding? You know, printmaking's too seductive. It must be something to do with me and the way in which I relate to whatever I'm working on, that I just kind of get so engaged with it that I almost kind of lose the point. And I started actually thinking about this recently and thinking, well, you know, it's so important to be continually rigorous with yourself. And, you know, I could actually sort of argue against myself and say, well, this kind of working cross media is just kind of every time you get to the point where you've got a problem with getting over-seduced by that medium, you just go to another, you know, our computer, okay, you know, now I'm going to make installations and now I'm going to make whatever. And, you know, that could be the flip side of it. I hope that that's not happening. I hope I'm maintaining enough rigour to actually really be true to each piece as it is actually developing. The only thing that I would say is that since my head injury, I'm no longer really dexterous in the way that I want to be. I'm still perfectly capable, but I can see well enough to see that I'm not making things adequately. And so I've had, for the first time, to actually really involve other people in the production process, which is something that I really fought against, being a sort of neurotic, obsessive, you know, kind of control freak. I wanted to do everything. I mean, I'd do the E6 processing if I could, you know. And for the first time, I've had to actually, you know, say, look, you know, this is what you know, this is what I want, only I want it to look better. Yeah, you know. And I thought that was going to lead to sort of an impoverishment. I thought, you know, if you just take something to somebody else, you just get a kind of technician. But I've found that, you know, if you find the right people and you work in the right way, you can actually get involved in very interesting collaborative projects where you're actually really gaining a lot. You know, it's not just that like you're this kind of person that hasn't got the skills. You're actually really gaining a lot, and I think that might be a route for me in some ways, perhaps. I mean, I'm certainly interested in working with programmers now in some of the stuff that I'm doing, and I think that might be a route for me to perhaps work with some other people to try and address that. But I mean, you know, we're all on a learning curve. I mean, I haven't, you know, when I'm no longer on a learning curve, I'll give up. But I mean, I haven't got that one sorted myself, really. But it's the problem. There's quite a few of us here who are ex restorers, and we're, you know, we all struggle with having too much facility in a way. Yeah.
Can I bring you to the point where you said that you were very against moving into the internet as a means of pushing the work?
Yeah, I'm not against the internet. I'm just trying to see if there's any of my oh yes, cyber cohorts here. I'm not against the internet. He's laughing. It just, you know, I mean, it just is like, I mean, it's just, I think it's nowhere to make art. I think the concept of cyberspace is fascinating, and the internet is a fantastic communication medium, which in you know, a year probably no one's going to be interested in. I mean, electromagnetism is fascinating, but you don't need to know anything about electromagnetism to turn on a light switch. And I suspect that it's just this kind of moment in history where people are getting very buzzy about the internet, which is really just, you know, telephone plus plus. I mean, there are artists making telephone artwork, but it's just, you know, you can't be interested in everything. I mean, it's not really my bag. I think it's a great medium for disseminating information.
No, it's interesting because you said very clearly that the experience of being in the gallery space, or perhaps it might not be a gallery sometimes, therefore the scale of the work is, you know, the physicality of standing in front or enclosed by the images. But then I was talking to someone the other day, McGregor, who's a dancer, choreographer, who's dealing with creating new dances on the internet with other dancers across the world, and that was like space on a different level, but he sees them as very real as opposed to virtual. It was just picking up on that dilemma of having to be enclosed or confronted, which you would think a dancer would demand, but in fact some dancers are creating new works.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose because I'm what I'm, you know, I mean, I like all kinds of work, and I get very irritated by people who say, well, I don't know work with technology, because I think, well, I don't have any problem relating to a painting, so I like all kinds of stuff, but obviously I have my preferences, and I am, I suppose, particularly hung up on the way, sensate way in which we receive data, and in using these kind of installations and optical tricks to sort of make it clear that where you stand in space makes a difference. And obviously that's a metaphorical, it's an allegory for where you stand psychologically, where you stand in relation to something makes a difference. So I suppose because that's what I'm so interested in, for me, the internet, which you basically relate to on a screen level, is a little bit impoverished. But I mean, there is interesting work. I mean, Stellark, who's one of my favourite artists and wonderful madman, did a performance at the ICA last year where he was basically, his body was being controlled. He was hooked up to some sensors, and his body was being controlled by movement on the internet. So he was using the kind of flow of global information to actually create this dance. I thought that conceptually was actually very interesting. It looked very painful for poor Stellark. Yeah.
So, is it possible for you to be able to describe when you do have an idea for a work or something, that you have these visuals, and then in some of your work you bring in words or writing, and some of it you don't? Is it possible to describe how when you decide to bring in writing into work or not?
I mean, that's it's quite difficult to explain. I mean, I suppose I know where your question's coming from. I mean, particularly with the show in Kettle's Yard, some people said, "Oh, it looks like it's a group show. The work's so different. We can't actually sort of recognise it necessarily as being the same artist." I think that really the only there's only really 3 pieces that I've made that have used text. The kind of one that I was sort of saying was rather unsuccessful, when I didn't bother reading the text out to you because it's terribly pretentious. And these 2 new data projections. I think that the work is all about similar kinds of things, and I think it's manifested differently just in relation to how that particular piece works. I mean, I think that those 2 data projections, the one that I showed you and the one that we couldn't record, were in a way originating very much from conversations, and I got kind of obsessed with the actual language that was being used to describe them, in the way that I got obsessed by the clipping, the newspaper clipping, and the remarked piece. And so it seemed like doing kind of somersaults in a way. It just seemed obvious to use it. And I was really trying to use this opportunity of this show in this quite unusual space. I mean, Kettle's Yard is very unusual in the sense that you can put lots of small pieces in it, to make a lot of pieces of work quite